For 11 years, Grace Whitfield never once let a stranger walk out of her diner hungry over $31. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he did for a living, or where he slept, or why his hands shook a little when he held his coffee cup. All she knew was that every few weeks, an old man in a gray canvas coat would sit in booth number 6, order the meatloaf special and a black coffee, and when the check came, he would pat his pockets with a small, practiced sadness and say, in the same quiet voice every time, "I seem to have come up short again." And every time, without a word, without a sigh, without ever once making him feel small, Grace would reach into her apron, take out 3 or 4 crumpled dollar bills from her own tip jar, and tell him not to worry about it. 11 years, 400 and some odd meals. She never told her manager. She never told her husband, not at first. She certainly never imagined that the man in booth 6 had, at that very moment, 11,000 employees, a private jet parked 40 minutes away, and more money than the entire county where her diner sat. She thought she was feeding a lonely old man who'd fallen on hard times. She had no idea she was the only person in Millbrook, Ohio, who passed a test that 200 other people had already failed. My name is Grace Whitfield. I'm 38 years old, and for the last 14 years I have worked the morning shift at the Millbrook Diner on Route 9, the kind of place with a bell over the door and a pie case that's been there since Eisenhower, where the coffee is bottomless and the regulars have their own mugs hanging on hooks behind the counter. I want to tell you what happened when the quiet stranger in booth 6 finally told me the truth, and what he did afterward, because it is the strangest, most wonderful, and in one terrible week, most frightening thing that has ever happened to my family. But first, you have to understand who I was before any of it started, because the woman this story is about is not somebody who set out to be kind for a reward. I want to be very clear about that from the first sentence, because everything that follows only makes sense if you believe that part first. I grew up 2 streets over from where I live now, in a house my father built additions onto for 30 years, without ever quite finishing any of them. He drove a delivery truck for a bakery in Dayton, and my mother cleaned houses on the east side of town for families who tipped her in leftover casseroles more often than cash. And if there is one thing that household taught me before I could read, it's that the difference between a good week and a bad week was never about how much you had. It was about who showed up when you didn't have it. I remember being 9 years old and watching my mother send a foil-wrapped plate of pot roast home with a neighbor woman, Mrs. Halloway, whose husband had just lost his job at the plant, and I remember asking my mother, "Don't we need that for ourselves?" And my mother looking at me with an expression I didn't understand yet and saying, "Gracie, you don't run out of that kind of thing by giving it away. You only run out of it by holding on to it too tight." I didn't understand her then. I understand her completely now, and some version of that sentence has been sitting behind my ribs every single day. I've worked that counter. I met my husband, Danny Whitfield, at that same diner, actually, which people find charming until I tell them the actual story, which is considerably less charming. He came in every Tuesday for 2 months in a booth by himself, ordered the same tuna melt, and never once said more than 4 words to me beyond his order. And I privately decided he was either painfully shy or possibly a little slow. And it took my coworker, Patrice, pointing out, "Grace, honey, he's not slow, he's terrified of you," for me to even notice the boy existed as anything but a tuna melt with legs. We got married 8 years ago at the Methodist Church on 4th Street. Small ceremony, 40 people. My father walked me down the aisle in a suit he'd owned since his own wedding, and Danny cried before I even got to the altar, which the pastor still brings up. Danny works maintenance for the county, mostly roads and the water treatment plant. Good steady work, not flashy work, and between the two of us we have made a life that I would call, without a hint of irony or self-pity, genuinely happy. We have 2 kids, Eli, who's 10 and thinks about dinosaurs roughly 90% of his waking hours, and Josephine, who's 6 and has strong opinions about which of her stuffed animals is allowed at the dinner table on any given night. We rent a 2-bedroom house on Willow Court that needs a new roof we cannot currently afford. We drive a truck with 211,000 miles on it that Danny keeps alive through what I can only describe as stubbornness and duct tape. And some months, especially in winter when the gas bill climbs, we sit at our kitchen table after the kids are asleep and do math on the back of an envelope that doesn't come out the way we want it to. I am telling you all of this not to make you feel sorry for us, because we are not a sad story. We are a normal story. The normal story of most working families in most small towns in this country. I am telling you this so you understand exactly how little room there was, in an actual dollars and cents sense, for me to be quietly covering a stranger's meals for 11 years. It was never money we had extra. It was money we decided every single time that we had enough of. The man in booth 6 first came in on a Thursday in March, back when Eli was still in diapers, which tells you how long ago this really was. I remember it specifically because it was raining sideways that morning, the kind of cold, early spring rain that gets into your bones, and the bell over the door rang, and I looked up expecting one of my regulars shaking off an umbrella, and instead there was this older gentleman, maybe somewhere between 60 and 70, hard to say, wearing a gray canvas work coat that had seen better decades, soaked through at the shoulders, no umbrella, no hat, just walking like a man who'd been out in that rain a while and had made his peace with it. He had the kind of face you don't forget once you've really looked at it. Sharp pale eyes, a neat white beard, the posture of someone who used to stand very straight and had decided at some point it wasn't worth the effort anymore. He sat in booth 6, which was empty, and he stayed in booth 6 every single time after that, like it had been assigned to him by some cosmic seating chart. Though, of course, nobody assigned it. He just always sat there, and eventually it became his, in that unspoken way corner booths become somebody's. He ordered the meatloaf special, which back then was $4.75, and a black coffee, no cream, no sugar, and he ate slowly, the way people eat when a meal is not something they're rushing through to get to the next thing, but the actual event of the day. And when I brought the check, he did the thing with his pockets, patted his coat, patted his pants, and then that small, sad laugh, almost embarrassed, and he said, "Well, that's a shame." I seemed to have come up short again and started to reach for his coat like he was going to leave without eating what he'd paid for, which of course he had already eaten every bite of. And I want you to understand, in that half second, I made a decision that I made again roughly 400 times over the next 11 years without ever once really deciding it. Fresh. Because after the first few times, it wasn't a decision anymore, it was just who I was in that specific situation. I said, "Don't worry about it tonight, sir, we'll square up next time," and I took $4 and change out of my own tip jar sitting by the register, rang the ticket as paid, and never mentioned it again. He looked at me for a second longer than the moment really needed, like he was trying to work out whether I meant it or was just being polite in the way people are polite when they secretly resent you. And then he nodded once, put his hat back on, which I noticed for the first time he was actually holding, not wearing, and walked out into that sideways rain without an umbrella. He came back 3 weeks later, same booth, same order, same patting of pockets, same small, sad laugh, and I did the same thing because by then some private, unspoken math had already run in the back of my head. $4 and change, once every few weeks, was not going to sink my household, and it seemed a great deal more important that an old man not go hungry or humiliated in my diner than that I collect $4.75 from him. Patrice noticed after the third or fourth time. She leaned over the counter one slow Tuesday afternoon and said, "Gracie, you know that man never pays, right?" And I said, "I know." And she said, "You know, he's probably not even actually broke. Some of these old guys just work the sympathy angle. My aunt used to wait tables, and she saw it all the time, and I remember shrugging and saying something like, 'And if I'm wrong about him, Patrice, what have I lost? $4. And if I'm right, and he really does need it, what have I saved him?' She didn't have a good answer to that, and honestly, neither one of us thought about it very hard after that, because in a town like Millbrook, you learn that everybody's got some story going on under the surface that isn't really any of your business, and mostly, you just let people be who they're going to be, and you do your job, and you go home. I did not think of him again, most weeks, until the bell over the door rang and there he was in that same gray coat, and some part of me would just quietly reach for the coffee pot and think, oh, there's my Thursday man, without any drama attached to the thought at all. Over the years, he told me small things, in the unhurried way of a man who has a great deal of time and no one particular person he's rushing to talk to. He told me his wife had passed some years back, though he never gave me a name or a year, just said it the way you'd mention weather, a fact of the landscape rather than a wound he wanted tended. He asked, every single visit, about my children, Eli's dinosaurs, and later his dinosaur facts, becoming increasingly specific and alarming, Josephine's stuffed animal seating arrangements, and he remembered details in a way that surprised me, asking 6 weeks later whether Eli had settled the ongoing debate about whether the T-Rex or the Triceratops would win in a fight, which was, at the time, a genuinely unresolved 4-year-old civil war in my household. He asked about Danny's work on the water treatment plant with what seemed like real, specific interest, not the polite nodding kind, the kind where he'd ask a follow-up question that made you realize he'd actually been listening. And he asked, more than anything else, about the diner itself, how business was, whether the roof leaked in the back corner, which it did, whether old Mr. Castellano, who owned the place, was thinking about retiring soon, which he was, loudly and often, to anyone who'd stand still for it. I answered all of it honestly, the way you answer an old man in booth 6 who orders the same meatloaf special every few weeks and never has quite enough money for it, because it never once occurred to me, not for one single year of the 11, that any of it mattered to him beyond simple, ordinary loneliness looking for a friendly face and a captive audience over black coffee. I thought I was being kind to a lonely poor man. I had absolutely no way of knowing that every single word I said in that diner was in its own way being weighed. The diner itself needs its own introduction, because it is not an incidental detail in this story, it is very nearly a character in it. Mr. Castellano's father built it in 1961 as a place called the Millbrook Grill, and Mr. Castellano took it over in the 80s and renamed it, with the kind of modest ambition small towns run on, simply the Millbrook Diner, and it has occupied the same low-brick building on Route 9 for so long that 3 generations of the same families have had their first job there, their first date there, their retirement coffee there, their funeral luncheon there. It seats 42 people if you count the 2 stools at the end of the counter that wobble. The pie case has a light in it that's flickered since before I started working there, and that nobody has ever fixed, because everyone privately agrees it adds character. Mr. Castellano is 74 years old, has a bad hip, and has been saying for at least 6 of the years I've worked there that he's thinking about selling, usually right after a particularly bad morning with the walk-in freezer, which breaks with a regularity that would be comic if it weren't so expensive. The truth, and everyone in town who thinks about it for more than 30 seconds knows the truth, is that the diner is not a wildly profitable business. Route 9 doesn't carry the traffic it used to since the highway went in 15 miles east. Millbrook itself has been shrinking, slowly, the way a lot of small Ohio towns have been shrinking. The feed store closed 4 years ago, the hardware store barely hangs on, the elementary school consolidated with the one in the next town over. The diner survives because Mr. Castellano owns the building outright, because his overhead is low, because Patrice and I and the 2 cooks, Manny and his nephew Curtis, work for wages that would make a city restaurant owner laugh, and because there is a particular loyalty in a town like this one that keeps people driving to a diner on a dying stretch of road instead of the chain place by the highway exit. A loyalty that doesn't show up on any balance sheet, but that everyone who lives here understands perfectly. I tell you all this because it matters enormously to what happened later, and because I want you to understand that when the old man in booth 6 asked me, across probably 4 separate visits over as many years, questions like whether the diner could survive another decade, or what would happen to it if Mr. Castellano finally did retire, or once, memorably, whether I'd ever thought about what I'd do if the place closed, I answered him the way you answer any customer making conversation, honestly but without any real weight behind it, because it did not once occur to me that a lonely old man who couldn't pay for his own meatloaf was in any position to do anything at all about the answers. The years move the way years do when you're raising small children and working full-time, which is to say both impossibly slowly in any given week and shockingly fast in the aggregate. Eli went from diapers to preschool to the specific breed of confident, dinosaur-obsessed second grader he is now. Josephine arrived, colicky and furious for her first 4 months, and an absolute delight ever since, as if she'd used up all her complaining in one concentrated early burst. Danny got a small promotion at the water treatment plant, enough to matter, not enough to change our lives. My father passed away 6 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of death you're grateful for even while it guts you, and my mother moved in with her sister 2 towns over because the house with all its unfinished additions was too much house for her alone. Through all of it, every few weeks, sometimes stretching to a couple of months if I didn't see him, the bell over the door would ring, and there would be my Thursday man, gray coat a little more worn each year, ordering his meatloaf and his black coffee, patting his pockets, offering his small, sad apology, and me reaching into my tip jar without a second thought, the way you reach for a light switch in your own house in the dark, an action so practiced it required no decision at all anymore. I want to tell you about the day I almost stopped doing it, because it's important, and because I've thought about that day more times in the last few months than almost any other single afternoon of my life. It was about 4 years ago, a genuinely terrible winter. Danny had been out of work for 11 days with a herniated disc, workers' comp checks running slow the way they always seem to when you actually need them on time, and we were, for the first time in our marriage, seriously behind on the gas bill, the actual shut-off notice kind of behind, and I remember standing at the register on a Thursday afternoon. The bell rang, and there was the old man, and some small, tired, frightened part of me looked at that tip jar, which had maybe $6 in it that whole shift, and thought, not today, just this once, I can't. And I watched him sit down in booth 6, and I took his order same as always, and I stood behind the counter afterward doing the math in my head, gas bill, groceries. Eli needed new shoes because his toes were hitting the front of the old ones, and for the length of time it took him to eat that meatloaf. I genuinely did not know what I was going to do when the check came. And then I thought about my mother, sending that foil-wrapped plate of pot roast home with Mrs. Halloway on a week I now understand. As an adult, doing my own kitchen table math must have been a terrifying week for my own parents. And I thought about the specific, particular dignity of an old man who had, as far as I knew, absolutely no one else in this world checking on him regularly, except a waitress at a diner on a dying stretch of Ohio Road. And I thought, if I let him walk out of here today feeling like even that last small kindness has run dry, what exactly have I actually saved? $4 and change, against a debt I could not pay off with $4 and change anyway. When the check came and he did his pocket patting routine, I took the last of the tip jar, $4.30, every bit of what was in there, and covered it, and told him not to worry about it. Same as always. And he left. Same as always. And I went home that night and cried in the bathroom for about 10 minutes where Danny couldn't hear me. Not over $4.30, but over the particular exhaustion of a week where even that small thing had felt. For about 2 hours, like it might be too much to give. I tell you this not because it's the most dramatic moment in this story. It very much is not. But because I think it's the truest one, and because I want anyone listening who has ever quietly kept up a kindness through a period when they genuinely couldn't afford to know that I understand exactly how that feels, and that it is not free, and it is not always easy, and the people who do it are not saints. They are just ordinary people who have decided, over and over, in small moments nobody is watching, what kind of person they are going to be. He came back the following week, and I covered his meal, same as always, and the gas got paid eventually, and Danny's back healed, and the shoes got bought second-hand at the consignment shop on 5th, and life went on the way it does, in a long, unremarkable string of Thursdays, until the spring of this year, when the old man in booth 6 sat down across from me instead of across the table, on a Tuesday mid-afternoon, the diner nearly empty between the lunch rush and the early dinner crowd, and said, in a voice I had never once heard him use in 11 years, a voice with none of the frail apologetic softness I associated with him, a voice that was, if anything, businesslike and clear, "Grace, I need about 20 minutes of your time, and I think you should sit down for this. I should tell you about the day the walk-in freezer died for good, because it's a small story inside the bigger one, and I think it explains something about Millbrook that no amount of me describing the town in the abstract ever could." This was maybe 5 years ago, deep January, the kind of cold where your truck won't turn over the first 3 tries, and the compressor on that ancient walk-in finally gave out overnight, with a full delivery sitting inside it. Meat, dairy, a week's worth of pie fillings Mr. Castellano had just paid for out of pocket. He came in that morning gray-faced, doing math out loud that none of us were supposed to hear, and Manny, our head cook, who has exactly one tone of voice and it is calm, said, "Mr. C, go call the repair place, we'll figure the rest out." And figuring the rest out looked like this. Patrice drove to 3 different stores with her own card because the business account was already stretched thin that month, buying ice to pack around what could still be saved. Curtis, who was 19 at the time and worked for tips that wouldn't cover a tank of gas some weeks, spent his entire shift off the clock, unpaid, hauling coolers in from his own truck bed. I called Danny, and he came by on his lunch break from the treatment plant with 2 shop fans to keep air moving through the walk-in so it wouldn't get worse before the repair guy showed. Old Ferris Dunbar, who eats pie at 2 o'clock every single day and has for as long as I've worked there, heard about it from Patrice and came back that same afternoon and paid for his pie a week in advance, $4 at a time, 7 separate transactions, because he said, and I remember this exactly, "I figured you could use the cash today more than you could use my patience about it." That's Millbrook. That's the actual town underneath the dying stretch of road and the closed feed store and the consolidated elementary school. It is a town that shows up for its own in small, unglamorous, cash-strapped ways, over and over. And I think that particular texture of the place, more than any single kindness of mine, is probably the real reason Arthur Kane kept coming back to Booth 6, long after he could have simply moved on to one of his other 3 towns and made a cleaner decision faster. I mention this because I want to be honest that I was never the only person in Millbrook who might have passed whatever test Arthur was quietly running. I think about that a lot, actually, in the months since all this came out. The strange, humbling accident of geometry that put me behind that specific counter on that specific rainy Thursday 11 years ago instead of Patrice, who would have done exactly the same thing, or Manny, who slips free meals to kids who come in after school with empty pockets and never mentions it to Mr. Castellano at all, quietly eating the cost himself some weeks. I don't say this to diminish what happened to me. I've made my peace with the fact that it did happen to me, specifically, and that peace matters. But I think it's important in telling this story not to make it sound like I was some singular saint in a town full of ordinary people. I was an ordinary person in a town that happens to be full of exactly this kind of ordinary decency, and I got to be the one standing at the register when it mattered. That's closer to the truth than any story about me being special. Arthur told me once, months later after everything had settled, that he'd actually eaten at 3 other establishments in Millbrook during his early visits, quietly, before he ever walked into our diner, testing the waters in a smaller way first, a gas station, a little sandwich counter that's since closed, a diner 2 towns over that isn't even in Millbrook proper. He said the sandwich counter, in particular, had come close. An older woman there had also quietly covered a shortfall for him once, though only the once, because he never went back, having already found Booth 6 by then and settled into it the way you settle into a chair that fits you exactly right. I asked him once whether he ever felt guilty, running this quiet, invisible test on people who had no idea they were being measured against some standard they never agreed to be held to. And he thought about that for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the formica and said, "Grace, I've asked myself that question more nights than you'd believe. And the answer I've landed on is that I was never testing whether people were good enough to deserve something from me. I was simply trying to remember myself what it felt like to be treated as a person rather than a balance sheet, because I'd started to forget. And forgetting that, for a man in my position, is its own kind of dangerous. You didn't owe me a lesson in humanity. You just happened to teach me one anyway. The same way the sun doesn't owe warmth to anyone in particular, it just happens to fall on whoever's standing in it. I want to be honest about the first thing I felt when he said that, because it wasn't excitement or curiosity or any of the things you might expect. It was fear. A small, sharp animal kind of fear. The kind that goes straight to your stomach before your brain has caught up with a reason for it. 11 years of a certain kind of person sitting in booth 6, and now suddenly a different voice coming out of the same face, and my first thought, God help me, was that he was dying, that this was some kind of goodbye, or worse, some kind of confession that would make me understand I'd been a fool the whole time, feeding a con man who'd been laughing about it in some other diner in some other town every night for a decade. Patrice was in the back, doing the lunch dishes with Curtis. Mr. Castellano was at the bank. The only other customer in the place was old Ferris Dunbar, who comes in every day at 2 for pie and mostly ignores everybody, hearing aid turned down low enough that he wasn't going to be listening to anything at our table. I sat down across from him. In the booth, I had refilled his coffee at probably 300 times, and he folded his hands on the formica and looked at me with those sharp, pale eyes, steadier now than I had ever seen them, and he said, "My name is not what you think it is, or rather, it is, but it comes with considerably more attached to it than you know. My name is Arthur Kane. I want to tell you honestly that the name meant nothing to me in that moment sitting there, because I am not a woman who follows business news or reads the financial pages, and if you had said Arthur Kane to me on any other day of my life, I would have assumed you were talking about somebody's uncle." He watched my face very carefully as he said it, the way you watch someone's face when you're testing whether a piece of information has landed the way you expected, and when he saw nothing but polite confusion, something in his shoulders relaxed, very slightly, like a held breath finally let out, and he said, "Good. That's actually good. That tells me something important." And then he reached inside that same gray canvas coat, the one I'd watched grow more worn and patched over 11 years, and took out a phone far too new and expensive-looking for a man I'd been quietly feeding for a decade, and he tapped it a few times and turned the screen toward me. It was a search result page. Arthur Kane, founder and chairman, Kane Industrial Holdings. There was a photograph, an official one, the kind taken for an annual report or a magazine profile, a man in an expensive charcoal suit standing in front of a wall of glass with a city skyline behind him. And it took me a genuinely embarrassing number of seconds staring back and forth between that photograph and the man across the booth from me before I understood I was looking at the same person, just cleaned up, dressed differently, photographed by someone whose entire job was making him look like exactly what apparently he was. The article beneath the photo had numbers in it that did not, at first, compute as numbers I associated with an actual living person I knew. Net worth estimated at $4.1 billion. Founder of a company with manufacturing operations in 11 states and interests I didn't understand in things like industrial logistics and supply chain infrastructure. I remember my mouth was actually open, and I remember the exact ridiculous thought that went through my head in that moment, which was not about the money at all. It was, he doesn't even have $4.75 on him half the time, and something about the absurdity of that specific detail against the number 4.1 billion made a small, stunned laugh come out of me before I could stop it, which turned out, thankfully, to be exactly the right response. Because Arthur Kane laughed too, for the first time in 11 years of watching that face, an actual real laugh, and said, yes, exactly. That's rather the point of the whole thing, Grace. He told me the story slowly over the next 20 minutes in that same clear, business-like voice, and I am going to tell it to you the way he told it to me, because I have turned it over so many times since that I know it almost word for word. He had built Kane Industrial from a single machine shop his own father started in Cleveland in the 1960s, grown it over 4 decades into the kind of company that shows up in business textbooks as a case study. And along the way, he said, without any particular self-pity, just as a plain fact of the life he'd chosen, he had lost the ability to know why people were being kind to him. He said, "When you have the kind of money I have, Grace, everyone who is nice to you has a reason, and usually the reason is the money. And after enough years of that, you start to lose the ability to trust a kind word from anyone. And eventually, if you're not careful, you lose the ability to be kind yourself, because you've forgotten what it feels like to receive it without an angle attached." His wife, Eleanor, had died 9 years earlier, and he told me, and this part he said quietly, looking down at his folded hands rather than at me, that in the last years of her illness, she had been the only person who still treated him like Arthur instead of like Kane Industrial. And when she was gone, he found himself surrounded by a company, a board, a staff of people whose kindness he could no longer separate from their salaries. And he had made, somewhat impulsively, a decision that his own lawyers and his own children thought was, in his words, evidence of a man losing his grip. He decided to disappear, periodically, deliberately, into small towns, wearing old clothes, carrying just enough cash to be convincingly poor, and see, with no company behind him and no name anyone recognized, who would still be decent to a stranger who had nothing to offer them in return. Millbrook, he told me, had not been an accident. Kane Industrial had, for about 2 years before I ever met him, been quietly considering a site in this part of Ohio for a new advanced manufacturing facility. The kind of investment that creates, he said, somewhere between 400 and 600 jobs directly and considerably more indirectly. The kind of project that could genuinely change the fortunes of a shrinking town like this one for a generation. There were 4 towns on the short list. He had visited all 4 of them personally, incognito, in old coats, over the course of about 18 months, not as Arthur Kane, the chairman, doing a formal site visit with consultants and spreadsheets, but as a poor stranger, testing something spreadsheets can't measure, which is what kind of place this actually is, underneath the tax incentives and the zoning documents to the people who might end up working there. In 2 of the 4 towns, he told me, plainly, without any editorializing, he had been treated with open suspicion or outright cruelty when he appeared unable to pay for a simple meal, once actually having the police called on him at a diner, not unlike this one, for the crime of not having enough money in his pocket. In a 3rd town, people had simply ignored him entirely, looked through him the way you look through anyone you've decided doesn't matter. And in Millbrook, at booth 6 of a diner on a dying stretch of Route 9, a waitress with 2 young children and a truck held together with duct tape had, on a rainy Thursday 11 years ago, and then several hundred times after that, quietly paid his tab out of her own tip jar and never once, not one single time in over a decade, made him feel like less of a person for needing it. I sat there, Grace Whitfield, 38 years old, wife of a county maintenance worker, mother of 2, and listened to a $4.1 billion man tell me that I had, without ever knowing it, been the deciding factor in where he was about to build a facility that would employ hundreds of people in the town where I was born. And I want to tell you honestly, what I felt in that moment was not triumph or vindication or even really surprise anymore, because by then the shock had already burned through me and left something quieter behind. What I felt sitting in that booth was something closer to grief for every single version of myself over those 11 years who had stood at that register doing math on $4 against a gas bill, wondering if I could really afford it that week, never once knowing that the answer to that private, exhausting question had been, this whole time, the entire future of my town. I need to tell you one more detail from that first Tuesday conversation, because I've replayed it so many times since and I keep finding pieces I left out. After he showed me the photograph and let the numbers sink in, Arthur asked me something I didn't expect, before he'd told me anything about the facility or the fund or any of what came after. He asked, "Grace, do you want to know why I chose the meatloaf special specifically, every single time, for 11 years, when the menu has at least 6 other things on it I'm told are quite good?" And I told him honestly, I'd always assumed he just liked it, the way regulars settle into a favorite without much thought behind it. He shook his head and said, Eleanor used to make something almost exactly like it, not from any recipe, just from memory of her own mother's kitchen. And in the last good year we had together before she got sick, that was the meal she made most often on Sunday evenings. And I have not been able to order it anywhere else in this country and have it come out tasting like anything except a stranger's approximation. Yours is the closest anyone has ever come, not because your cook does anything unusual with it. I asked him once, actually, your cook Manny, whether there was some secret to it. And he told me, quite honestly, no secret at all, ma'am. I just don't rush it, and I think that's actually the whole answer, Grace. Nobody rushes anything in this diner. That's the thing I kept coming back for, as much as I kept coming back for you. I sat with that for a long moment, because it reframed something I'd never quite understood about him. The specific loyalty to one dish across 11 years, despite watching him occasionally eye the daily specials board with what I'd always assumed was simple curiosity. It wasn't curiosity. It was grief, wearing the shape of a menu order, and I felt a fresh wave of something that wasn't quite guilt, but was closely related to it. The sense that I had been serving a much deeper hunger than the ordinary kind for over a decade without ever once understanding what I was actually feeding. I asked him, carefully, whether it had gotten easier over the years, coming back to that specific taste again and again, or whether it had stayed just as sharp each time. And he considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness he brought to everything, and said, both, somehow. It's gotten easier to sit with. It has not gotten any less sharp. I think that's simply what missing someone properly is supposed to feel like, Grace, if you're doing it honestly instead of trying to rush past it the way people expect you to after a certain number of years have gone by. Everyone wants grief to have a shelf life. I've found it mostly just changes texture instead of disappearing. And coming here, ordering the one dish that still tastes like her kitchen, has been the only place I've let it stay exactly as sharp as it actually is, instead of performing recovery for a boardroom that got uncomfortable with my sadness somewhere around the 18-month mark. I think about that conversation now every single time I see Manny plating a meatloaf special, unhurried, exactly the way he's always done it. And I think about how strange and quietly enormous it is that an ordinary diner cook's refusal to rush a Tuesday lunch order turned out to be, for one grieving billionaire, the single most reliable thread connecting him back to the last good year of his marriage. Manny still doesn't know the full story, incidentally. He knows the facility is coming, and he knows it has something to do with our regular in Booth 6, but he doesn't know about Eleanor or the meatloaf or any of it. And I've decided not to tell him, not because it's a secret exactly, but because I think there's something right about him continuing to make that dish exactly the same unhurried way he always has, without the weight of knowing what it's actually been carrying across the counter all these years. Some kindnesses work best when the person offering them never finds out the full size of what they're doing. I understand that now better than I understood almost anything else before this whole story started. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when your entire understanding of the last 11 years of your own life rearranges itself in real time. And I sat in that silence for what felt like a very long time, but was probably closer to a minute, while Arthur Kane waited patiently. The way I imagine a man who has spent 40 years in boardrooms learns to wait for other people to finish thinking. When I finally spoke, what came out of my mouth was not any of the big obvious questions. It was a small, almost embarrassing one. I said, "Does this mean you're not actually poor, and I don't have to worry about you eating properly anymore?" And something in his face when I said that told me it was exactly the right question, maybe the only question that actually mattered to him in that moment, because he laughed again, that same surprised, unguarded laugh, and said, "Grace, in 11 years, in 4 towns, across probably 200 interactions with people who thought I was destitute, you are the only person who, when I finally told them the truth, asked first whether I was going to be all right. Everyone else's first question, without exception, has been some version of what's in it for me now. I want to pause the story here for a moment because I think this is the part that matters most, and I've thought about it more than any other single detail since. He told me later, over the following weeks, as we talked more, that the other people he had tested this way, and there had been more than just the 2 towns with the bad outcomes. There had been individuals scattered across small towns for a decade, cashiers, a gas station attendant in Kentucky, a young man at a hardware store in Pennsylvania, that of the roughly 24 strangers who had shown him some form of unearned kindness while believing him poor, most of them, once the truth came out, had reacted with a kind of scrambling, apologetic excitement, already halfway to asking for something before they'd finished being surprised. He didn't blame them for it. He was careful to say that. He understood the position it put people in, suddenly finding out the shabby stranger they'd fed was worth more than their entire town's tax base combined. Of course, some scrambling instinct kicks in. But he said it changes something. Watching that happen, it confirms the very thing that made him start testing people in the first place, that money changes the temperature of every room it enters, whether you want it to or not. And then he said, "And Grace, you didn't do that. You asked if I was going to be all right. You asked that before you asked anything else, and I have been carrying that question around in my coat pocket for the last 3 weeks, trying to decide what to do about it." I told him, and I meant it completely, that I hadn't done anything special, that anyone would have done the same thing, and he shook his head slowly and said, "No, Grace, that's the entire point. Hardly anyone does, and I've spent 11 years in 4 towns finding that out the hard way." He told me then what he wanted to do, and it was considerably more than I expected, and considerably more than, I'll admit, I initially felt entirely comfortable accepting. Kane Industrial was going to build its new facility in Millbrook. That decision, he told me, had actually been made in his own mind about 6 months earlier, quietly, without telling his board yet, based on what he called the human diligence of the site, as opposed to the financial diligence his executives had already completed and approved. The town had good highway access once the new interchange went in, a workforce with the right kind of manufacturing background from the old plant days, decent water and power infrastructure, and now, the thing his spreadsheets could never have told him, it had at least one person in it who represented the kind of place he wanted his company actually rooted in. The facility alone, he said, would change Millbrook's fortunes considerably over the coming years, and that decision, he wanted me to understand clearly, had already been made independent of anything he was about to say to me next, so that I would never carry around any confusion about whether my kindness had bought the town's future or simply happened to align with a decision that stood on its own financial logic. I appreciated that distinction more than I can easily explain, because even in the surreal fog of that conversation, some careful part of me was already worried about exactly that question, whether Millbrook's whole future now rested on $4.75 worth of meatloaf, and he had clearly anticipated that worry and moved to close it off before I even had to ask. But then he said, "And for you personally, Grace, I want to do something different, something that has nothing to do with the facility decision at all, because you did not know for one single day of the last 11 years that there was any facility decision riding on any of this. You fed a poor old man because you believed he was a poor old man, full stop, and whatever I do next needs to reflect the fact that your kindness was never conditional on any of this being real." He told me he wanted to pay off our mortgage, in full, and I need to explain here that we don't actually have a mortgage because we rent. And when I told him that, slightly stunned, he simply nodded and said, "Then we'll discuss the house separately," and moved on in a way that told me this was a man used to adjusting a plan mid-sentence when new information arrived, without any drama attached to the adjustment at all. He told me he wanted to establish a fund in my name that would cover Eli and Josephine's education completely, whatever they chose, whatever it cost, all the way through graduate school if they wanted it. He told me he wanted to buy the building the diner sat in, quietly, through a holding company, not to change anything about how Mr. Castellano ran it, but simply to guarantee that whatever happened to Mr. Castellano's health or retirement plans in the coming years, the Millbrook Diner itself would never close for lack of a building to sit in. And separately, entirely separately, he wanted to set up a retirement fund for Mr. Castellano himself, structured in a way his accountants would work out so that the old man could finally retire with dignity whenever he chose, without needing to sell the place to strangers who might turn it into something it wasn't. And he wanted, he said, his voice slowing down here in a way that told me we'd arrived at the part he'd rehearsed least, for me to have the option, if I wanted it, and only if I wanted it, of never needing to work another day in my life unless I chose to. I sat there, and I want to describe honestly what was happening in my body during all of this, because it wasn't joy. Not yet. It was something closer to a kind of vertigo, the physical sensation of the floor tilting slightly under a chair that hadn't actually moved. Patrice came out from the back at some point during all of this, saw the two of us deep in some conversation she'd never seen at that table before, and had the good sense, God bless her, to simply top off Ferris Dunbar's coffee and disappear again without asking. I remember looking down at my own hands on the Formica table, hands that had been reaching into a tip jar for 11 years without ever once expecting anything to come back the other direction. And I remember the first fully formed thought that arrived. Once the vertigo settled enough to let a thought through, and it surprised me because it wasn't about the money at all. It was, I need to call Danny. Not because I needed his permission. We've never operated that way in our marriage. But because in 14 years together, he has been standing next to me for every single version of the hard math I've ever had to do at that kitchen table. And it did not feel like a thing I was allowed to know alone. I need to back up and tell you about the specific conversation Danny and I had that first night at our kitchen table, with the envelope that finally had no hard math left to do on it. Because I think the shape of that conversation matters more than the outcome, and because I suspect anyone listening to this who has ever imagined what they'd do with a sudden windfall has never quite pictured how strange it actually feels in the room with you. We sat there for almost 3 hours that first night, past midnight, coffee gone cold, and we made 2 separate lists, one on each side of the same sheet of paper, because Danny said, only half joking, we should probably write down what we're scared of before we write down what we want, or we'll end up wanting things out of fear instead of out of any real desire. The fear list came first, and it was longer than either of us expected. Danny wrote in his blocky maintenance worker handwriting, what if the kids grow up thinking money solves everything? What if we stop understanding each other because I still worry about the truck and you don't have to anymore? What if people in town start treating us different? Not badly, just different. Like we're not quite us anymore. What if Grace has to explain to every single person who ever hears about this for the rest of her life why she deserved it, when she never once thought she was doing anything to deserve anything? I added my own. What if the diner stops feeling like my job and starts feeling like a costume I put on for a story people want to hear? What if Eli asks for something Josephine can't have and money makes that seem simple in a way it never used to be, and isn't? What if I lose the specific, ordinary satisfaction of knowing I built a good week out of careful choices? The exact satisfaction I got from stretching a paycheck exactly far enough. Because that satisfaction, believe it or not, was never entirely about survival. Some real portion of it was about being good at something hard. Then we made the want list, and it was, compared to the fear list, almost embarrassingly short, which I think surprised us both. We wanted our kids to never have to choose between shoes and heat. We wanted the diner, specifically the actual physical diner, the building itself with its flickering pie case, to outlast both of us regardless of what happened to Mr. Castellanos' health or retirement plans. We wanted Danny's mother to stop pretending her hip didn't hurt because she was worried about the cost of finally getting it looked at properly. We wanted, and this one surprised me when it came out of my own mouth, for Patrice, who has worked that counter next to me for 9 years and has her own harder story I won't tell here because it isn't mine to tell. We wanted her to have some kind of soft landing too, if we were going to have one. That was the whole list. 4 items against a fear list nearly 3 times as long, and I remember looking at that lopsided piece of paper and thinking, this is either the proof that we're going to be all right with whatever comes next, or it's the last honest conversation we have before all of this changes us anyway. I choose, 4 months later, to believe it was the first one. I called Arthur 2 days after that kitchen table conversation, and I read him almost exactly what I'm telling you now, the fear list and the want list both, because I didn't want to negotiate with him the way you negotiate with someone trying to sell you something. I wanted him to understand the actual shape of what Danny and I could hold without it changing who we were. He listened without interrupting the whole way through, and when I finished, he was quiet long enough that I asked if he was still there, and he said, "Grace, in 40 years of doing business, I have negotiated with executives who wanted 8 figures and dressed up their fear as ambition to make it sound better in a boardroom. You just read me a fear list longer than your want list, unprompted, and asked for less than I offered you 3 separate times in that conversation. I am going to give you almost exactly what's on that second list, no more, because I think you're the only person who has ever correctly understood, in front of me, that more is not automatically the same thing as better. And that, more than anything else in this whole story, is the moment I understood that whatever Arthur Kane had built with $4.1 billion, some part of him underneath all of it was still just a tired old man who'd been waiting a very long time for somebody to want less than he was offering. I called Danny from the small office in the back of the diner, the one Mr. Castellano uses mostly to store extra napkins and pay invoices, and I remember my hands were shaking hard enough that I dropped the phone once trying to unlock it. He picked up on the second ring in the middle of his own shift, background noise of the treatment plant behind him, and I said, "Danny, I need you to sit down," which is, I realized later with a strange laugh, almost exactly what Arthur Kane had said to me 20 minutes earlier, and there is something fitting about that. The way a piece of news like this gets passed along the same way it arrived. Sit down, this is bigger than standing up for. I told him as fast and as clearly as I could, the name, the search result, the 4 towns, the 11 years, the facility, the fund, all of it tumbling out in an order that probably made no sense at all. And there was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I said, "Danny, are you there?" And he said, in a voice I'd never quite heard from him before, thick and unsteady, "Gracie, is this real?" And I said, "I don't know yet. I genuinely don't know yet, but I don't think he's lying." And Danny said quietly, "I need to come home." And I said, "No, finish your shift. We're not doing anything crazy today. We're going to think about this like grown-ups." And he laughed, this small, broken laugh, and said, "Gracie, a billionaire just offered to pay off a mortgage we don't have. I don't think grown-up thinking really applies today." And I remember laughing, too, right there in that cramped little office surrounded by napkin boxes, laughing and crying at the same time in a way that probably would have alarmed anyone who walked in. We did think about it like grown-ups, though, eventually, over the following days, and I want to tell you honestly that it was not the simple, easy joy you might imagine. Arthur gave us time. He insisted on it, actually. Told me before he left the diner that day that he did not want an answer that afternoon or even that week, that he understood this was disorienting, and that any decision made in the first rush of it would not be one either of us could trust later. He gave me his direct number, not an assistant's number, his own, and told me to call whenever I had questions. And then he did something that struck me as more telling about his character than almost anything else in that entire conversation. He asked if he could keep coming to the diner, not as Arthur Kane, the philanthropist, making a grand gesture, but back in the gray coat, back in booth 6, ordering his meatloaf, at least for a while longer, because he said, and I believed him completely, that booth 6 was the only place in his entire life where he got to simply be a man eating lunch, and he wasn't ready to give that up yet just because I knew the truth now. I told him, of course, and he did come back the following Thursday, gray coat and all, and when I brought his check, he made a small joke about patting his pockets, and I laughed so hard I had to lean on the counter, and Patrice looked at the two of us like we'd both lost our minds, which I suppose, in the very best way, we sort of had. Danny and I sat at our own kitchen table 3 nights later, after the kids were down, with that same worn envelope we usually did our hard math on, except this time there was no hard math to do. There was just an overwhelming, almost frightening amount of open space where the hard math used to live, and neither of us quite knew what shape to give it yet. I want to be honest about something here that I think doesn't get said often enough in stories like this. There was fear in that room. Real fear, not just gratitude. 14 years of scraping and careful envelope math had built a version of ourselves we understood completely. People who knew exactly how far a dollar stretched and exactly what to do when it didn't stretch far enough. And suddenly, being told that particular struggle was over felt, for about the first week, less like relief and more like losing a language we'd spent our whole marriage learning to speak fluently together. Danny said something that night I've thought about often since. He said, "Gracie, I'm not scared of the money, I'm scared of who we become around it." And I think that's the single most honest sentence either of us said in that whole strange stretch of time. We decided together, slowly, over about 2 weeks of long conversations, what we actually wanted, as opposed to what we were simply being offered, which turned out to be a meaningfully different list. We did not want to stop working entirely, either of us, at least not yet, not suddenly, because our jobs were not just income to us. They were structure, identity, the daily architecture of who we were in this town, and giving that up all at once felt less like freedom and more like falling. We did accept the education fund for Eli and Josephine without much hesitation at all, because that felt like a gift for 2 children who hadn't done anything yet to earn or not earn it. Simply an open door we'd get to watch them walk through however they chose. We accepted a much smaller version of the housing gift than Arthur first proposed, enough to buy the house on Willow Court outright from our landlord, who was delighted to sell, rather than the much larger house Arthur had initially, gently, suggested we consider, because Willow Court was where our kids had learned to walk and where Josephine's height marks were penciled into the door frame of the hall closet. And neither of us wanted a bigger house so much as we wanted our house, permanently, unshakably, ours. Danny kept his job at the treatment plant. I kept my job at the diner, at least for now, though we agreed, together, that some year down the road, not yet, maybe not for years, I might want the option to step back, and that door would simply exist for me now in a way it never had before, unhurried, unforced. The facility itself moved forward the way these things move, through zoning boards and county commissioners and a genuinely thrilling town meeting at the high school gymnasium, where the mayor, a tired, decent man named Kowalski, who I've known since I was in grade school, stood up and announced, with his voice actually cracking partway through, that Kane Industrial Holdings would be breaking ground on a 420-job advanced manufacturing facility on the old grain elevator land off Route 9. And I sat in the 3rd row between Danny and Mr. Castellano, who had been let in on a carefully limited version of the story by then, and watched 300 of my neighbors erupt into the kind of noise a gymnasium hasn't held in Millbrook in a very long time. Nobody in that room, except the 4 or 5 of us who already knew, understood that the reason Kane Industrial had chosen this particular dying stretch of Ohio Road over 3 other towns with better spreadsheets and cheaper land was sitting quietly in the back corner, a woman in a diner uniform who'd clocked out an hour early to be there, who had spent 11 years handing a stranger $4.75 out of her own tip jar without ever once wondering what, if anything, it might come back to her as. I should describe the town meeting itself more fully, because I've told you the headline of it, the mayor's cracking voice and the gymnasium noise, but I skipped past the hour before it that mattered just as much to me. Danny and I arrived early before most of the folding chairs had even been set up, and I remember standing in that gymnasium, the same one where Eli has his gym class, the same one where I went to my own senior prom 20 years ago under considerably more modest decorations, and feeling the specific vertigo of a room about to hold 2 entirely different versions of the same evening for 2 entirely different audiences. To everyone filing in with their coats and their coffee thermoses, this was a town meeting about jobs, plain and simple, the kind of good economic news that doesn't happen often enough in a place like Millbrook. To me, sitting in the 3rd row with a secret still only partially shared, it was something considerably stranger, watching my neighbors receive a gift that had traveled to them through a decade of my own quiet, unremarkable Thursdays. Mr. Castellano sat beside me, and I want to describe what I'd told him by that point, because it wasn't the whole truth yet, not the size of it, just enough that he wouldn't be blindsided the way the rest of the room was about to be. I'd told him, a few days earlier, sitting in his cramped office among the napkin boxes, that the quiet man from Booth 6 had turned out to be considerably more than he appeared, and that he was the reason behind the facility everyone was about to hear announced. Mr. Castellano had looked at me for a long moment. 74 years old, bad hip, 50 years behind that counter counting his father's memory into every corner of the place, and said, "Gracie, I've watched you feed that man for years without a single complaint, and I always figured either you were the kindest fool in Ohio or there was something going on I didn't understand. And I'm relieved, genuinely relieved, to find out it's the second one, because I was starting to worry about our margins." It was such a Mr. Castellano thing to say, deflecting real emotion into a joke about the books, and I laughed so hard I had to wipe my eyes before the meeting started, which several people around us clearly misread as tears of civic pride, which, in fairness, wasn't entirely wrong either. When Mayor Kowalski actually said the number, 420 jobs, I watched the room the way you watch a wave arrive, a half second of stunned silence, and then the noise breaking all at once. And I want to tell you specifically about the faces I could see from the third row, because they're the faces that have stayed with me longest. I saw Curtis, our young cook, sitting with his girlfriend, and I saw him grab her hand so hard she yelped, because Curtis has been quietly hoping for exactly this kind of opportunity, something steady enough to finally propose on for over a year. A fact I only learned later, but that made sense of the look on his face instantly. I saw a woman I recognized vaguely from the elementary school, one of the teachers who'd been let go when the school consolidated, and I saw her actually put both hands over her mouth, the particular gesture of someone doing fast, hopeful math about whether this might mean a school reopening someday, might mean her own job coming back in some form. I saw old men who'd worked the original plant back before it closed in the 90s, men whose whole adult identity had been built around manufacturing work and had spent 30 years since feeling like the town, and maybe the country, had quietly decided people like them weren't needed anymore. And I watched something straighten in their spines that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with being told, all at once, that they'd been wrong about that. Afterward, in the parking lot under those tall sodium lights that turn everyone's coat the same shade of orange, dozens of people came up to me, not because they knew anything yet about my part in it, simply because I was standing near Mr. Castellano, and people assumed, correctly as it happened, that the diner crowd would have early information about anything happening on Route 9. I answered their questions as honestly as I could without giving away what wasn't mine alone to give away yet. And I remember an older woman, a stranger to me actually, gripping my arm and saying, "My grandson's been driving 40 minutes each way to a job that barely covers his gas money. Tell me this is real." And I told her, "It's real, ma'am. I promise you it's real." And watching her face when she heard that, watching hope arrive somewhere it had clearly been rationed carefully for a long time, is a memory I suspect I will keep with the same clarity 20 years from now that I keep the memory of that first rainy Thursday with the man in the gray coat. Some moments simply attach themselves to you permanently, and you don't get to choose in advance which ones those will be. You just recognize them afterward by how often you find yourself returning to stand inside them again. I wish I could tell you the story ends there, at the gymnasium, with the applause and the mayor's cracking voice and Danny squeezing my hand so hard it left a mark, but it doesn't. And I promised myself when I decided to tell this story that I would tell all of it, including the 6 weeks that followed, which were, without question, the hardest 6 weeks of my adult life, harder in their own way than any of the lean years that came before them. Because money, it turns out, does not arrive quietly into a small town. It arrives with a noise all its own, and the noise it made in Millbrook eventually reached the one place I never expected it to reach, which was the boardroom of Kane Industrial Holdings, 400 miles away, and the 2 adult children of Arthur Kane, a son named Preston and a daughter named Vivian, neither of whom I had ever met, and neither of whom, it turned out, had any intention of quietly accepting that their father had given a diner waitress in rural Ohio what Preston Kane's own lawyer would later describe, on paper, in a filing, as an amount of money and influence wildly disproportionate to any rational business relationship. I found out about it the way most bad news finds you now, which is to say a phone call from someone who'd already seen it online before I had any idea it existed. Patrice called me at 7 in the morning, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her, and said, "Grace, honey, you need to look at this before you come in today," and sent me a link to an article on a business news site with a headline that I still, even now, feel a small twist in my stomach reading back. It said something like, "Billionaire Kane's secret diner fund raises questions among family board." The article was careful. Legally careful, full of the word alleged, but underneath the careful language, the story it told was ugly and simple. It suggested that Arthur Kane, 71 years old, grieving widower, had been, in the words of an unnamed source close to the family, exhibiting a pattern of erratic and uncharacteristic behavior for the better part of a decade, disappearing for stretches of time, giving away significant sums to strangers, and that this particular incident, involving what the article called an Ohio waitress and her family, had finally prompted his own children to seek what the article termed a formal capacity evaluation, the exact same legal territory, though I did not know this at the time, that families use when they believe an elderly relative can no longer be trusted to manage his own affairs. I want to describe honestly what it felt like to read that article, standing in my own kitchen in my work uniform with my son eating cereal 6 feet away, asking why my hands were shaking. It felt like 11 years of quiet, unremarked kindness. Kindness I had genuinely never once connected to any expectation of return, being turned, in the space of about 4 paragraphs written by someone who had never met me, into a story about a scheming woman who had somehow manipulated a vulnerable old man out of his fortune. I had not asked Arthur Kane for $1 single in 11 years. I had, if anything, initially pushed back on the scale of what he wanted to give us, and now there was a version of events circulating in the world with my actual name in it, Grace Whitfield, that painted me as something I had spent my entire adult life specifically deciding not to be. Danny found me still standing there when he came down for his coffee, and I watched his face go through the same journey mine had, shock, then a kind of protective fury I had genuinely never seen in 14 years of marriage. And he said, "Gracie, this isn't right. We need to call somebody." And I said, "Who?" "Danny. Who exactly do we call?" And the honest answer, in that moment, was that I did not know. We were not people with lawyers on retainer. We were not people who understood how to defend ourselves against a story printed by people with considerably more resources and considerably more practice at this particular kind of fight than we had ever needed in our lives. I called Arthur's direct number, the one he'd given me weeks earlier, hands shaking hard enough that I misdialed twice. And when he picked up, his voice sounded older than I had heard it since that very first day in the rain, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with a fight he'd clearly been having, out of my sight for several days already, one he hadn't wanted to burden me with until it broke into the open. He told me, and I believe every word of it, that Preston and Vivian had known, in general terms, about his habit of disappearing into small towns for years, had tolerated it as an eccentricity of a grieving man they didn't fully understand, but chose not to fight, right up until the moment it involved $4.1 billion of company-adjacent assets and a facility decision affecting shareholder value, at which point eccentricity became, in their lawyers' careful language, a pattern consistent with diminished capacity. He told me Preston, in particular, had never forgiven him for the way he'd grieved Eleanor, had wanted his father to grieve properly and privately, and then return to the boardroom the way a Kane was supposed to, and had watched, with what Arthur described as a growing unspoken resentment, as his father instead wandered off in old coats to diners in states his own children couldn't locate on a map without help, And now, Arthur said, his voice breaking slightly in a way I had never heard from him, now they have found the perfect vehicle for a fight they have wanted to have with me for 9 years. And unfortunately, Grace, the vehicle is you, and I am so deeply sorry that my own grief and my own decisions have landed on your family's doorstep in the form of a headline you did nothing to earn. The following days were the strangest of my life, stranger even than the day I found out who he was. Because that day had been surreal in a wondrous, vertiginous way, and this was surreal in a frightening one. A local news van actually parked outside the Millbrook Diner one morning, and Mr. Castellano, 74 years old with a bad hip, walked out to that van personally and told them, in a version of events Patrice recounted to me with enormous relish afterward, that they could either order breakfast like decent human beings or get their vehicle off his property before he called the county sheriff, who happened to be his wife's cousin. Eli came home from school one day and asked me, with the particular bluntness of a 10-year-old, if we were in trouble, because a kid in his class had said his mom stole money from a rich man, and I sat on the edge of his bed that night and had to explain, in words a 10-year-old could hold on to, that sometimes when something good and unusual happens to ordinary people, other people, who don't understand it, make up stories that feel simpler to them than the truth, and that the truth, our truth, was simply that I had been kind to a lonely old man for a long time without knowing anything else about him, and that kindness is never, ever something you should be ashamed of, no matter what anyone says about it afterward. He seemed to accept that, in the uncomplicated way children accept things when the adult they trust says them steadily enough. And I remember lying awake that whole night, wishing I could believe my own words with quite that same uncomplicated steadiness. I want to go back and describe the week between the article and the Cleveland meeting more fully, because it was the longest week of my life, and I don't think I've fully done it justice yet. The morning after Patrice's phone call, I went into work anyway, because not going in felt like admitting there was something to hide from, and I remember standing behind that counter with my hands trembling slightly as I poured coffee, waiting for the first regular to look at me differently. It didn't happen the way I feared it would. Old Ferris Dunbar came in at his usual 2 o'clock, ordered his usual pie, and when I set it down, he looked up at me over his glasses and said simply, "Don't you let those city people tell you who you are, Gracie. I've watched you feed strays and drunks and lost truckers off Route 9 for 14 years without asking a single one of them for a dime. And no article written by somebody who's never set foot in this county is going to convince me otherwise." It was such a small thing, an old man with pie and strong opinions, but I nearly cried right there at the counter, because it was the first proof I had that the ground under my feet in this town, at least, was not going to shift no matter what the rest of the world decided to believe. Not everyone was as steady as Ferris, though, and I want to be honest about that too. My own cousin Denise, who I hadn't heard from in probably 3 years beyond a Christmas card, called that same week, and I answered thinking, foolishly, that she'd seen the article and wanted to check on me. And instead, she spent the first 4 minutes of the call asking increasingly specific questions about how exactly this Arthur Kane Fund worked and whether there might be room in it for, and I'm quoting her directly, family who've always been there for me too, which was news to me, since I could not immediately recall a single instance of Denise being there for me in any capacity beyond that annual Christmas card. I told her, gently as I could manage under the circumstances, that there was no fund available for extended family, that Danny and I had in fact turned down more money than she was imagining existed, and I heard something in her voice curdle almost instantly from concern into a kind of flat, transactional disappointment. And she got off the phone within about 90 seconds of realizing there was nothing in it for her. It was a small, ugly moment, and it taught me something I hadn't fully understood before, which is that sudden money doesn't just invite strangers with cameras into your life. It also reveals which of the people already in your life were closer to strangers than you'd realized. Danny's mother, by contrast, drove the 2 hours from Worcester the same day the article broke, without calling ahead, and let herself in with the spare key she's had since Eli was born, and I came home from my shift to find her already halfway through making a pot roast in my own kitchen. the way she does when she doesn't quite have the words for comfort, but knows exactly how to cook it instead. She hugged me at the door and said, "I don't care what any of them are saying. I raised a son who married well," and she meant it as the simplest, most complete statement of loyalty she had, and it landed exactly that way. She stayed 3 days, more or less running our household so Danny and I could handle the legal calls and the increasingly strange voicemails from numbers we didn't recognize. Reporters, mostly. 1 or 2 calls that felt considerably less friendly than reporters. Vague and unpleasant enough that Danny eventually had our number changed. And through all of it, she kept that kitchen running. Dinner on the table every night at 6. The kids fed and bathed and read to. A small, fierce woman making sure the machinery of ordinary life kept turning, while the extraordinary part of our life threatened to swallow the whole week whole. I also have to tell you about the night, 3 days before Cleveland, when Danny and I had the closest thing to a real fight we've had in our entire marriage. Not about the money, but about fear wearing money's clothes. He came home from a long shift, agitated in a way I hadn't seen from him, and he said, almost accusingly, "Do you regret it, Gracie? Do you regret ever taking his money out of the tip jar that first day? Because I keep thinking, if you just let him walk out without paying that one time, none of this would be touching our kids right now." And I felt something in me go hot and defensive. And I said, "Danny, are you actually asking me if I regret being kind to a lonely old man?" And he said, "No, that's not," and stopped and put his head in his hands at our kitchen table. And I understood, watching him, that he wasn't really angry at me at all. He was frightened, genuinely frightened. In the particular way a father gets frightened when he can't identify exactly what's threatening his children, but knows something is circling closer than he'd like. I sat down next to him and I said, "Danny, listen to me. If it cost us this exact week, this exact fear, and gave us nothing else at all, not $1, I would still do it again every single Thursday, because the version of me that doesn't reach into that tip jar isn't someone I actually want to be married to either. And I don't think you want to be married to her." He was quiet a long time. And then he reached over and took my hand on the table and said, "No, I really don't. I'm sorry. I'm just scared." And he said it plainly, without any defensiveness left in it. And that, more than anything, Miss E. Okafor said in that Cleveland office 3 days later, is the conversation that got me through the door with my spine straight. The capacity evaluation, when it finally happened, took place not in Millbrook, but in a law office in Cleveland, and Arthur asked me to come, which surprised me, and which I said yes to before I'd fully thought through what it would mean to sit in a room with 2 adult children who had, by then, spent a solid month characterizing me in legal filings and quiet phone calls to reporters as either a naive fool or a calculating opportunist, depending on which version served their argument better that week. Danny came with me. We drove up the night before and stayed in a motel off the highway because we couldn't afford, and honestly wouldn't have accepted, even if we could, the kind of hotel Preston and Vivian Kane were presumably staying in. And I remember lying in that motel bed unable to sleep, running through 11 years of Thursdays in my head like a rosary, trying to find, somewhere in that decade, some moment where I could honestly accuse myself of having wanted something back. I never found one. That, more than anything Arthur's lawyers eventually presented, is what got me through the door of that office the next morning with my spine straight. The room was exactly what you'd picture. A long table, a court reporter, Arthur's own attorney, a careful gray-haired woman named Ms. Okafor, who Arthur had used for decades, and across the table, Preston Kane, 44 years old, in a suit that probably cost more than our old truck, and Vivian Kane, 41, who I noticed would not quite meet my eyes when we were introduced, which told me more about her own doubts than anything she said for the next 3 hours. There was also, and this surprised me, a neuropsychologist retained independently by Arthur's own legal team, a Dr. Reyes, who had spent 2 full days with Arthur the previous week, running the kind of cognitive assessments I'd only ever seen referenced on television, and whose written findings, entered into the record before a single question was asked of me, stated plainly that Arthur Kane demonstrated cognitive function, memory, and executive reasoning consistent with a man 15 years younger than his actual age, with absolutely no indicators of the kind of impairment that would support any claim of diminished capacity. I watched Preston's face when that finding was read into the record, and I watched something in it that I can only describe as a man who had built an entire month's strategy on a foundation he'd known. Somewhere underneath was already cracking. But the finding didn't end the meeting, because the finding, as Miss Okafor gently reminded everyone, addressed whether Arthur understood what he was doing, not whether the people around him deserved what he was doing it for, and that distinction was exactly the door Preston walked through next. He turned to me directly, for the first time, and I want to describe his voice honestly because it wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was carefully, coldly reasonable. The voice of a man who has convinced himself entirely that he is the only adult in the room. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm sure you're a lovely person, but I have to ask you directly, because no one else in this process seems willing to, did you know, at any point during those 11 years, who my father actually was?" And I said no, not until the day he told me himself, this spring. And he said, "But surely you suspected something. An educated woman doesn't simply believe an elderly stranger is destitute for 11 straight years without ever once Googling his name." And I told him, plainly, that I am not sure what he means by an educated woman. I have a high school diploma and 14 years waiting tables. And it had never once, not one single time, occurred to me to research the financial background of a sad old man who couldn't pay for his own meatloaf. Because that is not, in my experience, Mr. Kane, generally how kindness works. You don't do a credit check before you decide someone is worth feeding. Vivian spoke next, and her question, though gentler in tone, cut closer, because I think she meant it more honestly than her brother meant his. She said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I believe you didn't know. I actually do believe that part. What I don't understand is why, now that you do know, you haven't simply said, 'This is too much. Please don't do this.'" My mother spent the last years of her life watching my father give pieces of himself away to a company that never gave enough back, and I watched her do it, and I am asking you honestly as one woman to another, why you haven't protected him from himself the way I wish someone had protected her. And I sat with that question for a moment because it deserved a real answer rather than a defensive one, and I told her the truth, which was that I had said exactly that. More than once, in the weeks after Arthur first told me who he was, that Danny and I had turned down the larger house, had kept our jobs, had asked for considerably less than what was first offered, precisely because we were frightened of exactly the thing she was describing. Becoming people defined by what we'd received rather than who we already were. But I told her that there is a difference between protecting someone from a con and protecting them from their own generosity, and that her father is, by every measure available in this room today, a man of entirely sound mind who has decided deliberately and repeatedly that this is how he wants to spend a portion of what he built, and that the two of us refusing every dollar out of some abstract fear of what it might look like would not actually be respecting Arthur Kane. It would be substituting our judgment for his, which is, I gently pointed out, looking at both of them, precisely the accusation currently being leveled at me. Arthur had been quiet through most of this, letting his lawyer and the doctor's report do the heavy work, but at that point, he spoke, and I watched both his children go very still, the particular stillness of adult children who still, underneath everything, brace themselves when their father's voice changes register. He said, "Preston, Vivian, I loved your mother for 41 years, and in the last 3 years of her illness, when I was tired and frightened and grieving in advance for a woman who wasn't gone yet, there was exactly one person who ever asked me a question that had nothing to do with the company. And it was a waitress in Ohio who asked whether my late wife had liked pie, because she'd noticed I always ordered a slice to go on Thursdays and never seemed to eat it there. He looked at me when he said this, and I remembered that exact conversation from maybe 4 years back, a small, unremarkable Thursday I hadn't thought about since. He said, "That woman has never asked me for a single dollar in 11 years, has pushed back on every dollar I have tried to give her since, and has just spent the last 10 minutes in this room defending my right to my own judgment against my own children, at real risk to herself and her family's reputation, for no reason I can identify except that she apparently believes it's the right thing to do. If either of you can find me, anywhere in this company, one employee, one board member, one so-called friend from the country club, who has ever done a fraction of that for me, expecting absolutely nothing in return, I will withdraw every dollar of this gift myself tomorrow morning. Otherwise, I am asking you, as your father, to let this be the one decision in my life I don't need your permission for. There is one more piece of the Cleveland meeting I haven't told you, because I've thought hard about whether it belongs in this story at all, and I've decided it does, because it's the part that changed how I understood Arthur most completely. During the recess, while Danny and I sat in that side room with our bad coffee, Ms. Okafor came in briefly to check on us, and she told me something Arthur had apparently asked her to share, something he hadn't wanted to say himself in front of his children. She said, "Mrs. Whitfield, before you go back in there, I want you to know something about why Arthur really started this whole practice of disappearing into small towns, because I don't think he's told you the complete version yet, and he asked me to be the one to tell you because he finds it easier to let me say hard things than to say them himself." She told me that in the last 6 months of Eleanor's life, when hospice had come into their home and everyone around Arthur had shifted into that careful, hushed register people use around the dying, he had overheard, entirely by accident, a conversation between 2 members of his own household staff, people who had worked for the family for over a decade, discussing in low voices in the kitchen what would likely happen to their positions once Eleanor passed and Arthur presumably retreated further into the company or, they speculated, remarried within a year or two, the way wealthy widowers apparently often did, and whether they should start quietly inquiring about other positions now rather than be caught without options later. Arthur told Ms. Okafor, and she was very precise in repeating his words to me, that what had gutted him about that overheard conversation wasn't the practicality of it. He understood completely that people need to secure their livelihoods, and he never once blamed them for the conversation itself. What had gutted him was realizing, standing in his own hallway with his wife dying 20 feet away, that he could not tell, and had perhaps never been able to tell, which of the dozens of people who had shown him warmth and loyalty over the decades were doing it because they genuinely cared for him and Eleanor, and which were doing it the way you tend a garden you depend on for your own harvest, carefully, professionally, without malice, but without love either. He started disappearing into small towns 4 months after Eleanor's funeral, Ms. Okafor told me, not as a business strategy, not initially connected to any site selection process at all. That came later, but simply as a man trying to find out, somewhere in the world, whether ordinary kindness between strangers still existed in a form uncomplicated by what he could do for someone in return. She said he had told her more than once that he expected to find his answer within a year, maybe 2, and instead it took him the better part of a decade and 4 separate towns, and that by the time he found booth 6 at the Millbrook Diner, he had genuinely begun to wonder whether the answer he was looking for simply didn't exist anymore, whether he'd waited too long to go looking for it, whether grief had made him chase something that had only ever really existed in his memory of a simpler, younger version of the world that maybe was never quite as simple as he remembered it being. I sat with that, in the side room, with my bad coffee going cold, and I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before, which is that I had not simply been tested by a wealthy man curious about a small town's character. I had been, without ever knowing it, part of one grieving man's long search to find out whether it was still safe to believe in people at all, after watching money slowly poison his ability to trust the very warmth he most needed in the worst years of his life. When we went back into that room and Preston asked me his cold, careful questions, I answered them. I realize now, not entirely for myself, but partly for every version of Arthur Kane that had walked into a diner somewhere in this country over the past decade and quietly, invisibly, hoped to be wrong about what he'd started to believe about people. I don't know if I fully understood in that moment how much that mattered. I understand it completely now, and it has changed, permanently, how I think about every single person who walks through the door of my own diner still. The ones in good coats and the ones in torn ones alike. Because you never actually know, do you, looking at any stranger across a counter, exactly what quiet, private test they might be carrying, or exactly what it might mean to someone if you simply, without calculation, choose to be kind. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that, and I watched Vivian's eyes go bright and glassy in a way she was clearly fighting hard against, and I watched Preston's jaw work silently, the particular expression of a man recalculating an entire argument in real time and not liking where the new numbers landed. It was Vivian who broke first, and I will be honest, of the two of them, she is the one I came away with real sympathy for, because I don't think her fear was ever about money the way Preston's ultimately was. I think her fear was genuinely about watching her father get hurt again after watching her mother's illness hurt him for 3 long years. And fear like that doesn't always argue fair, but it comes from a real place. She said quietly, "Dad, I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to keep anyone else from taking something from you. And I don't know how to tell the difference anymore between someone who actually loves you and someone who's very good at appearing to." Arthur reached across the table, an unusual gesture in a room built for lawyers and formal distance, and took his daughter's hand and said, "I understand that, sweetheart. I understand it better than you know, because I have spent 9 years, since your mother died, asking myself that exact question every single time someone smiled at me in a boardroom. That's precisely why I went looking for an answer the way I did, in old coats, in towns nobody would recognize me in, because I needed to find out, somewhere in this world, whether the answer to that question could still sometimes be yes. Preston asked for a recess, and the meeting broke for about 40 minutes, during which Danny and I sat in a small side room drinking bad coffee from a machine, not speaking much. Both of us wrung out in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of defending your own character to strangers who'd already decided what you were before you walked in the room. When we reconvened, Mrs. Okafor announced that Preston and Vivian Kane had agreed to withdraw the petition for capacity evaluation in full, formally, on the record, and that the family had reached what she called a private understanding regarding go-forward communications that she would not be detailing further in this setting, which I understood correctly to mean that whatever had happened in that 40 minutes was a family matter that belonged to the Kanes and not to the court reporter's transcript. Preston did not apologize to me directly that day, and I want to be honest about that too, because this is not a story where every hard edge gets sanded down into a neat bow by the end. What he did do, as we were all gathering coats and folders to leave, was pause near me at the door and say, more stiffly than gracefully, "For whatever it's worth, Mrs. Whitfield, I looked into you rather thoroughly this past month. Financial records, employment history, the whole unpleasant process. And I found exactly nothing, which I am told by people whose job is finding things, is genuinely unusual. I'm not apologizing for doing my diligence. I am telling you that the diligence came back clean, and a man in my position doesn't get many chances to say that about anyone, so I'm saying it now. It wasn't warm, but I understood underneath the stiffness that it was the most honest thing he knew how to offer, and I told him I understood, and that I hoped, someday, he'd come to Millbrook and let me buy him a slice of pie, on the house, no tip jar required, and something almost like the beginning of a real smile crossed his face before he caught it and put his professional expression back on and walked out to his car. Vivienne did apologize, in the parking garage, catching up to us as Danny was unlocking our truck, and she said it plainly without excessive drama. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitfield. I let my own fear write a story about you that wasn't true, and I hope, Someday, if you're willing, I'd like to actually meet you properly, not across a legal table. I told her I'd like that too, and I meant it. And in the months since, she has in fact visited Millbrook twice, quietly, without press, and sat in booth 6 herself once and ordered the meatloaf and left an enormous tip that Patrice still talks about, and asked me, genuinely curious rather than suspicious, what her father was like in the years she hadn't been there to see, which I answered as honestly and generously as I could, because I think that's a gift I was uniquely positioned to give her. 11 years of a version of her father she'd never gotten to witness, tired and vulnerable and unguarded, ordering meatloaf and a coat that had seen better decades. The article that started all of it got a quiet follow-up piece a few weeks later, considerably shorter, considerably less read, the way corrections always are, confirming the neuropsychological findings and the family's, quote, resolution of the matter, unquote. And I have made a kind of peace with the fact that the version of this story that lives loudest on the internet is still, for a certain kind of stranger, who only read the first headline, a story about a scheming waitress, rather than the truth of what actually happened. That used to bother me considerably more than it does now. Danny helped me get there, actually, one night on our back porch a few weeks after Cleveland, when I was still turning it over bitterly, and he said, "Gracie, the people who matter, the people in this town, the people at that gymnasium, Mr. Castellano, Patrice, our own kids, they all know exactly who you are. They've known it for 14 years, long before any of this happened. And a headline written by a stranger who's never once refilled anybody's coffee doesn't get to overwrite 14 years of Thursdays." He was right, the way he usually is about the things that matter most, in that quiet, unglamorous maintenance worker way of his that I have never once mistaken for lacking depth. I want to tell you about the ribbon cutting, because it happened just last month, and it is, in a strange way, the real ending of this story. More than the Cleveland meeting, or even the day Arthur first told me the truth. The facility isn't finished yet, of course. That's still a year out. But Kane Industrial does this thing at the start of major builds. A small ceremonial groundbreaking with an actual ribbon stretched across 2 stakes in the mud, mostly for the local paper and the county commissioners to have their photograph taken. And Arthur insisted, over what I later learned was some mild objection from his own PR department, that I be the one to cut it, not him, not Preston, who did end up coming after all, quietly in the back row, not even Mayor Kowalski, who I think secretly wanted the honor and was gracious enough never to say so. I stood out there in late morning light in October, the old grain elevator rusting behind the ceremony, like a monument to what this land used to be. In a good coat Danny had insisted on buying me for the occasion, my first genuinely new winter coat in 9 years, and I looked out at maybe 200 people from town, Patrice and Manny and Curtis, given the morning off to attend. Ferris Dunbar in the second row in a suit I'd never seen him wear, Mr. Castellano leaning on his cane, looking prouder than I'd ever seen him look about anything, including the diner itself, my own mother down from her sister's place 2 towns over, Eli and Josephine right in front holding a hand-drawn sign that said, in Josephine's 6-year-old handwriting with Eli's help on the spelling, "My mom feeds people," which is, I have decided, the single greatest thing anyone has ever written about me, and I intend to have it framed. Arthur stood just off to the side, not at the podium deliberately. He told me later he wanted this specific moment to belong to the town rather than to Kane Industrial. And when Mayor Kowalski finished his remarks and handed me the ceremonial scissors, considerably too large and clearly meant for photographs rather than actual cutting, I looked out at all those faces. People I've poured coffee for, people who covered my freezer bill in an emergency, people who are, in every way that has ever mattered, my actual family regardless of blood, and I said something I hadn't planned to say, hadn't written down, hadn't even really thought through until it was already coming out of my mouth. I said I want everybody here to know that I didn't do anything special. I fed a hungry man because he was hungry, the same way I'd feed anyone who walked into that diner and didn't have quite enough, and the same way about a dozen people in this crowd would have done exactly the same thing if they'd been standing where I was standing that Thursday instead of me. This groundbreaking isn't really about me, or even really about Mr. Kane. It's about the fact that this town, underneath everything that's closed down and moved away and gotten harder over the years, never once stopped being the kind of place where people take care of each other without checking first whether it'll pay off. That's what got found here. Not me specifically. This town specifically. I cut the ribbon and the crowd made a noise that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. And Josephine ran up and hugged my legs before anyone could stop her, sign still clutched in one fist, and I picked her up. 420 jobs worth of future construction dust already settling on the grain elevator ruins behind us, and thought, not for the first time that year, about a rainy Thursday 11 years earlier that I very nearly don't remember clearly anymore. It's become so worn smooth by retelling. An old man in a gray coat, $4.75, and no earthly idea, not the faintest whisper of an idea, about anything that was still to come. It has been a little over 4 months now since that day in the diner, when Arthur Kane sat down across from me instead of across the table and told me to sit down for what he had to say. And I want to close this out by telling you where everything actually stands, because I think the middle of a story like this one is always more dramatic than the end. And I think the end deserves telling honestly too, unglamorously, the way real life settles after the noise dies down. The facility broke ground 3 weeks ago on the old grain elevator land, and if you drive out Route 9 past the diner, you can see the foundation work already underway. Steel and concrete, where there used to be nothing but weeds and a rusted grain elevator nobody had used since I was in high school. Mayor Kowalski tells anyone who will listen that hiring will begin in earnest by next spring. 420 jobs, real jobs. The kind that let a young family in this town buy a house instead of renting one. The kind of thing that changes not just individual lives, but the whole slow arithmetic of what a town like Millbrook gets to be for the next 20 years. Mr. Castellano retired 6 weeks ago, quietly, with considerably more financial peace of mind than he'd had any right to expect from a small-town diner. And the building itself is now, through arrangements I still find a little surreal to think about, permanently secured against ever being sold out from under whoever runs it. He handed the keys, in the end, not to some outside buyer, but to Patrice and me together, as co-owners, an arrangement Arthur helped structure, but that Mr. Castellano insisted on choosing himself because he said, and I'm quoting him exactly, "In 50 years, nobody has ever loved that ugly, flickering pie case as much as you two have. It should stay in the family, even if the family isn't blood." Patrice cried when he said it. I cried harder. We reopened 3 weeks later with the same menu, the same booths, the same bell over the door, and a new sign out front that still says Millbrook Diner, because neither of us could imagine calling it anything else. Danny still works at the treatment plant, though he's cut back to 4 days a week now, which gives him Fridays with Eli and Josephine that he never had before. And I have watched something soften and lengthen in my husband these past months, a kind of unhurried joy in ordinary Friday afternoons that 14 years of tight envelope math never quite allowed him. Eli's education fund sits untouched and growing, and he has, this week's obsession, decided he wants to be a paleontologist, which delights me precisely because it is exactly the kind of expensive, impractical, wonderful dream a child should get to have without his parents doing silent math about student loans in the back of their minds while he says it out loud. Josephine remains firmly committed to her stuffed animal seating chart and has recently added a new member to the household roster, a stuffed dinosaur her brother gave her that has been granted, after some tense negotiation, a permanent seat at the table. Arthur still comes to the diner most Thursdays. He doesn't wear the gray coat anymore, not because he's ashamed of it, he told me once, but because he said the test is finished now. This booth doesn't need to be an experiment anymore. It can just be a place he likes to eat lunch, and I think that distinction matters enormously to him. He still orders the meatloaf special. He still leaves now an amount on the table that would make Mr. Castellano's old cash register weep, and I still, every single time, try to talk him down from it, and he still, every single time, refuses to be talked down, and we have settled into a comfortable, ongoing argument about it that I suspect will continue for as long as he keeps walking through that door. Vivian visits every few months now and has become, unexpectedly, someone Josephine adores, mostly because Vivian takes her stuffed animal seating disputes with total seriousness, which is apparently all a 6-year-old actually requires from an adult to grant them her whole heart. Preston has not visited Millbrook, not yet, but he sends a card at Christmas now, which Arthur tells me is, for Preston, a fairly significant gesture, and I have decided to take it as exactly that, a small door left open rather than a door still closed. I think about the 11 years often, turning them over the way you turn over a stone you've had in your pocket so long its shape has become familiar by feel rather than by looking. I think about the winter I almost didn't cover his tab, the $4.30 that felt for one exhausted hour like it might be too much to give. I think about how close that decision sat to the edge of going the other way, not because I was a bad person in that moment, but because I was a tired one, and tired people sometimes make the smaller choice not out of cruelty, but out of simple depletion. And I think the real lesson in that particular memory isn't really about Arthur Kane or Kane Industrial Holdings at all. It's about the fact that you almost never know. In the moment, you're deciding whether to be kind to someone with nothing obvious to offer you back, what that kindness is actually worth, to them or to you. And I think if I had known, back then, exactly what was riding on that decision, I might have frozen up entirely, might have made it a performance instead of a simple, unremarkable act between two people at a diner counter. The not knowing, I've come to believe, was the whole point. It's the only way kindness like that stays honest. If you take one thing from this story, and I hope you take more than one, but if it's just one thing, let it be this. You will almost certainly never find out in this life the full weight of most of the small kindnesses you extend to strangers who seem to have nothing to give you back. Most of them will simply disappear into the ordinary texture of an ordinary day, unremarked, unrewarded, and that is exactly as it should be, because the version of kindness that only shows up when a reward might be waiting on the other side of it was never really kindness to begin with. It was just a very patient kind of investment. I fed a lonely old man in a torn gray coat for 11 years because it felt like the right thing to do on a rainy Thursday morning, and I would have kept doing it for 11 more, or 20 more, or for the rest of my working life, whether or not his name had ever turned out to be anything more than the name of a tired stranger who liked meatloaf and missed his wife. The facility, the fund, all of it, that was never the reason. It was simply, unexpectedly, generously, what came walking back through the door one Tuesday afternoon in a gray canvas coat, patting his pockets, same as always, except this time, for the first time in 11 years, he had absolutely everything he needed, and he'd come back anyway just to tell me the truth. If this story moved you today, do something small and unglamorous with it before the day is over. Leave a bigger tip than you planned to. Let a stranger go first. Cover the cost of something for someone who can't quite manage it and never mention it again. You will probably never find out what it was actually worth. Do it anyway. That's the whole secret. That was always the whole secret. I want to answer some of the questions people have asked me since word of this got around town, because I think the honest answers matter more than the polished version I could give instead. People ask, most often, whether I still think about the other 3 towns Arthur tested, the ones that failed, and I do, more than I expected to. He told me a little more about them, eventually, not to shame those places. He was careful never to do that, but because I asked, directly, wanting to understand what exactly had gone differently there. In the town where the police were called on him, he said the woman behind that counter hadn't done anything cruel exactly. She'd simply followed a policy, called it in because that's what the sign on the door said to do, and he told me he didn't blame her personally. He blamed something larger and colder that had crept into how a lot of places now handle anyone who looks like they might be trouble. A kind of protective suspicion that isn't wrong to have exactly, but that had cost that particular town whatever chance it had. In the town where people simply looked through him, he said that was in some ways the hardest one to sit with, because nobody there did anything wrong either. Nobody was rude, nobody called anyone. They simply didn't see him at all. An old man in a worn coat, becoming a kind of furniture in their peripheral vision, and he said there's a particular loneliness in being looked past rather than looked at unkindly, one he hadn't fully expected to feel as sharply as he did. People also ask whether I ever resent that it took 11 years, whether some part of me wishes he'd told me sooner, and I understand why they ask that, but the honest answer is no, and I've thought hard about why not. If he'd told me in year 2 or year 5, I don't think I could have promised him or myself that I would have kept doing exactly what I was doing with exactly the same unthinking ease. Because once you know there's an audience, even an audience of one enormously wealthy man, some part of you starts performing for it, however much you don't want to. The 11 years of not knowing weren't a delay before the real story started. They were the real story. They were the only way the test could have meant anything at all to either of us. I want to tell you, too, about a smaller moment that happened just last week because I think it belongs at the very end of this. A young couple came into the diner, new to town, moved here for the father's job at the plant that's still under construction, and the husband, ordering coffee and a sandwich for himself and his very pregnant wife, came up short at the register, genuinely short, 70 cents, fumbling through his pockets with the exact same small, embarrassed apology I'd heard from Arthur 100 times over 11 years. And I want to tell you that I didn't hesitate for even half a second this time, not because the tip jar was any fuller than it used to be. Some weeks it still isn't. But because I finally understood something all the way down in my bones that I'd only half understood before. I told him not to worry about it, we'll square up next time, and I watched his shoulders come down from around his ears the way shoulders do when shame gets lifted off them unexpectedly. And his wife looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because I think I've worn that exact expression myself, more than once, on harder weeks than I'd like to admit. I don't know who that young man is. I don't know if he's a billionaire in a borrowed coat testing my particular corner of Ohio. And I want to be completely honest that it does not matter to me, even slightly, whether he is or isn't, because I understood, watching him walk out with his sandwich and his 70 cents still in my tip jar's debt, that the entire lesson of these last 11 years was never actually about Arthur Kane at all. It was about the fact that you get to decide every single day, in small unwitnessed moments at a register or a counter or a kitchen table, who you're going to be when nobody's keeping score, and once in a very great while, so rarely that you should never ever count on it or wait for it, the universe happens to be keeping score after all. But the deciding has to come first, and it has to come without the hope of the score attached, or none of it means what it's supposed to mean. That's what I'd want my own children to understand about all of this, more than the facility or the fund or any of it. Be kind on the Thursdays nobody's watching. That's the only version of the story that was ever actually true, from the very first rainy morning to right now, and it's the only version I ever want them to remember, long after they've forgotten every other detail of what happened to their mother the year a stranger in a gray coat finally told her the truth.